In the last topic, we touched on some of the APIs that exist, like Flutter, Wave, Paystack, Doja, Smile. We even looked at Slack. And I touched on how you're going to like read an API document, how you're going to access the documentation for a third-party application. I will talk about how you install it, not really how you install it, but how you figure out how to install it. In this one, I'm talking about other type of APIs that are not third-party APIs that you'll be integrating your application into, right? These ones are more device-centric APIs. Device-centric APIs, like the browser API, the media recorder APIs, the Bluetooth API. So if you're building an application for the web, for example, you need to interact with certain device APIs. The browser only exposes certain APIs to you. And now there's a limit to what you can do because you are building a web application. For example, you can't access the file storage API. I mean, technically you can access the file storage, but there's a limit to what you can do. You can only read from it. You can't write to the file storage. So that's why whenever you want to download a file, the browser has to hijack the process and download it on your behalf. Also, when you want to read a file, you see it brings out a small window. Let me go to a random site that requires me to upload something to show you an example. So, image to be 64. Now, this is just a random site that requires me to click on a search input box. So when I click here, you can see the browser takes hold of the whole process. This is a native browser interface, right? For me to select the file, because my application does not have access to the file API directly. The browser can only provide me with the file I've specified on it, and I can't actually write to the file. But however, there's some APIs that your browser actually gives you access to, like Bluetooth. So let's just take a look at some of them, like the Bluetooth API, web. So you can see developer.mozilla.org is where you see most of the web documentation. And you can see this API is not available in web workers, not expressed via web navigator. Okay, this is an experimental technology. Take the production, the web API. So this allows you to connect to a Bluetooth device via the web. It claims you're building an application that requires you to connect to Bluetooth via the web. You can read more on it, read how to interface with it, what are the methods you call. Yeah, so that's that Bluetooth, the referring device, returns the reference device, if any, from which of the user open current case. Yeah. So let's get another one, for example, the camera, right? So let me go to camera API, web. So this is how you do it. The media.get user, media device allows you to get user camera details, a video track, or the virtual video camera, video recording device. So yes, there are many of these APIs that the web actually exposes. Not just the web. For the web, the browser is your bridge between the operating system and your web page, right? So it's the browser that determines what you have access to and what you don't have access to. For applications, they are building an Android application, for example, you are closer to the device itself, so you can build more native applications. You have access to more APIs than the web would have access to because you are closer to the low-level stack, right? And so with that in mind, then Android application would have access to the Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, screen. When you give permissions, for example, you also enable permissions on if you're used to Android phones or iOS phones, right? So you are given access to many of all these components. Your user is given access to, you have to have access to many of all these APIs, the screen, the Bluetooth, the lock screen, drawing over applications, camera, video. So these are also APIs, right? So I mean, you might be thinking of API just in context of REST API, Flutter, Wave, Paystack, but no, all these ones are also APIs. And remember what I said, API is a set of standards or interfaces that one system, in fact, the full meaning is application programming interface, right? So it's a set of standards or protocols or systems that one software exposes for another system to communicate with it. So for your application to communicate with the operating system, which is another software, it needs to talk to those APIs to call it, right? So you can say, start searching for Bluetooth, and it calls the API that starts searching for Bluetooth, and your device picks it up. There are other, the operating system also relies on certain APIs that your device hardware provides, your microcontrollers provide, it goes all the way down and down and down the stack. Right? It doesn't end. Different layers of API stacks on top of each other to build a complex system that you cannot build your application on top of. So that's it. There are so many APIs out there for almost anything you do. And when you're starting a new project, you might want to think first, do I build from scratch? Do I leverage an existing API? Or do I leverage an existing a library that abstracts the API for me? And that's very context driven. Depends on what you're trying to build and how deep you're building and how mature that system is in its own. So yeah, just read a lot, Google some APIs, come up with something weird and just see if there's an API already in the device for it. For example, an API to control the fan of your laptop. I just thought of that. Let's check it out. An API to control the fan. API fan, computer, Windows. So let's see what we get from that. So Stack Overflow, is there a Windows standard way to do things and search and the speed? I'm at the moment working on a project that, among other things, controls the computer fan. Basically, the fan are controlled by super chip. Using the partner power, but Windows does not supply any. So Windows does not supply any API for you to any driver for you to, because there's an API available, but it doesn't really supply a driver for you to control the fan. Some things are available, some things are not available. Fan is relatively serious. You can use it to hack it and cost overheating of the system or not. So you want to reduce the amount of APIs you expose. For your personal projects, you might want to expose certain APIs for other people to connect to it. And you have to think of security. You have to think of how they are going to use it. Rate limiting. Rate limiting is how much request can they make to my system? How much request am I going to allow them make to my system to avoid them crashing or overloading my system or misusing my system? So you think of security, think of rate limiting, very important. When you're designing your own API, you think of ease of use, how easy it is for them to integrate and use it. The easier it is, the more people will be spent using it. We can discuss more of this in a live class or in a one-on-one session. So just read more on this, and I'll see you in the next content where we would actually now look at webbooks.